Thank you, Vivian, for the nice introduction. And Skip, also thank you for having me to the Clinton School. I have a few prepared remarks I'd like to go through, and then to the extent that we have some time, we'll try to respond to questions or observations that you may have. And so as I arrived here, really late yesterday, it occurred to me what a vital and interesting time this is for the Clinton School. Your mission is educating and preparing individuals for public service in an era of renewed trust in government. We are also seeing tremendous excitement over our bright, young, new U.S. president. So it reminds me of a time nearly a half-century ago when we had another young president, John F. Kennedy, who believed fervently in public service. You may not know that he made a tape recording for the memoirs that he would never ultimately be able to write. And on it he said, quote, "It is this profession, these politicians who make the great decisions of war and peace, prosperity and recession, the decision whether we look to the future or to the past. In a large sense, everything now depends upon what government decides," unquote. So in many respects, he could have said that even yesterday, let alone nearly half-century ago. So what you do in the Clinton School and what the graduates will do in the future matters a great deal to our country. But just as perceptions of government are changing, we also need to change perceptions of our energy future. So irrespective or regardless of the euphoria in Washington over alternative energy, I think it's really time for a wake-up call. There is still a great deal of oil and natural gas in America's energy future. What the oil industry does in years ahead, or rather what the government allows us to do, matters a great deal as well. It matters a great deal to you, your children, your grandchildren. So, why do I believe this? So first of all, let's start with green energy. Most people agree that we need renewable energy and energy with lower carbon footprints. I believe that, you believe that, we believe that in ConocoPhillips. But experts, both within and outside the energy industry, have reached a very telling conclusion. They have considered growing world population, economic development in countries like China and India, and likely future energy demand, which is going to be increasing. They have also analyzed the potential offered by both existing and prospective energy sources. And what they found is that by bringing enough alternative energy online to play a major role in meeting future demand is going to take many decades to come. And it's also going to cost trillions of dollars. So as a result, even by the year 2030, fossil fuels will still supply nearly or possibly more than 80% of our total world energy demand. The alternative simply cannot be brought on fast enough to change things very quickly. Second, there is no magic solution. There is no abundant, cheap alternative on the horizon that can quickly replace oil, natural gas, and coal. The alternatives will almost certainly be more expensive. They will also impose their own environmental burdens. And third, there still is a great deal of undeveloped fossil fuel potential. I mean, even to prove this, let's take a look at the state of Arkansas. Since 1991, natural gas production here has increased 160%. This has been achieved by using new technology to produce unconventional gas from tight sands and from shale rock. And this is not exclusive to just the state of Arkansas. Thanks to the same technology, since 1993, U.S. natural gas resources are up 45%. And much of these new resources are onshore and on privately owned land, which means it was available to the industry for leasing and development. Some also came from the Gulf of Mexico, It's one of Gulf of Mexico. It's only one of two places in the lower 48 where the government allows offshore drilling. The other is offshore California, and that's very restrictive. So really offshore is really the Gulf of Mexico. Think about what we might have achieved if the government had opened up some of the other 97% of offshore acreage, or some of the prospective land in the western U.S. that remains off limits. The 27-year-old offshore drilling moratorium, it did expire late last year. But the Obama administration has ordered a 6-month delay in the process of preparing for leasing. In any event, initial lease sales are several years away if they ultimately are allowed at all. So this de facto extension of the moratorium is occurring despite the fact that U.S. imports 60% of the oil that we use today. Despite the fact that the Gulf has been one of the most important energy sources for decades, and also despite a very good environmental and safety track record. And finally, despite the national polls showing that by 2 to 1, the public supports offshore drilling. Drilling opponents would like to point out that the U.S. uses 25% of the world's energy. We also have the largest economy in the world. But we have only 3% of its oil and gas reserves. But to some extent, this is partly a result of our choices. Our country chooses to import oil rather than to allow expanded drilling here, and thus exports nearly $500 million a day for imported oil, while also exporting countless investment and production jobs. We could certainly replace some of these imports with domestic production, and in the process, put many Americans to work. So let's talk about the choices in front of us, some recommendations and the course that the Obama administration has proposed. First, the U.S., we need a balanced national energy policy, with the word balance being the key word. Congress, over the years, has passed a number of constructive energy bills, but taken collectively, they never solve the energy problem. None of these bills dealt comprehensively with all forms of energy. They never took the opportunity to both increase supply and also to reduce demand. Instead, they focused on the sources that were popular at the time while ignoring or even at sometimes penalizing other sources of energy. Now, I have a colleague in the state, not here tonight, David Wood, the new CEO of Murphy Oil here in Arkansas. He points out we need a different approach that incorporates 4 principles. First, broad supply diversity of supply. Second, greater energy efficiency, utilize your energy better. Technological innovation, and sound environmental stewardship, including addressing climate change. So I'll explain, starting with diversity. We need more energy in all forms from a diverse location around the world, where we get the energy, as well as here at home. Our company strongly supports development of alternative and renewable sources, like solar, wind, geothermal power, biofuels, and nuclear. The Obama administration clearly does so as well, but proposes incentives to encourage their development. But more on diversity here in a moment. The second part of the policy must be improving our energy efficiency. Since the 1970s, the U.S. has doubled its economic output per unit of energy consumed. Well, that's good, but we can still do far more. The public is driving less, so gasoline demand is down. There's also a greater awareness of the need to have more energy efficiency at home and at work. But this all is largely as a result of recession and not necessarily all conservation. We believe that the government can inspire far more improvement in energy efficiency. It can do this through public education and by enacting broader efficiency standards in transportation, home, and the workplace. Now, the Obama administration agrees that conservation is essential. Third, our policy would ideally promote innovation by encouraging research and development. Industry is making substantial investments already. government can encourage further private investment by granting incentives, not necessarily to the energy producers, but the academic institutions. We also need public investment in technology that realistically can't be funded by the industry, such as those that require very long lead times or advanced science. And you might ask what? Well, they would include natural gas hydrates, nuclear fusion, carbon capture, storage. We would benefit too from greater support of our educational system, particularly as it relates to science and technology. And here again, the administration agrees on many of these points. And fourth, our policy must ensure good environmental stewardship, including addressing greenhouse gas emissions. ConocoPhillips believes that our industry must supply cleaner forms of energy, cleaner forms of fossil fuels. In our case, we produce clean-burning natural gas, we blend ethanol into our gasoline, and we are researching next-generation non-food biofuels. And we are developing new materials for the lithium-ion batteries that will be used in electric cars. Now, on climate change, we acknowledge that the scientific consensus that greenhouse gases from fossil fuels are contributing to global warming. Accordingly, we believe that federal legislation is essential in order to create price signals for carbon avoidance. This will make it possible for the industries affected to make the investments required to reduce emissions. In support of our belief, we are America's only major oil company, along with the foreign companies Shell and BP, to belong to the U.S. Climate Action Partnership. So working in this organization, we have a seat at the table with the other industries, the environmental NGOs, and so we have found some common ground. And we are calling for a mandatory national framework to slow, stop, and then ultimately, with time, to reverse the growth of carbon emissions. And this includes principles that can be incorporated into international cooperation and action. Now, as you know, the Obama administration is tightening environmental standards, calling for action on climate change. So we, in many respects, we are in broad agreement once again. But there's a problem with the administration's positions on energy, and it's a big one. The U.S. and the world today, and has and will continue to run on fossil fuels. The administration has fallen into the old trap of ignoring and even penalizing the resources that actually keep our factories running today. And as a result, America will end up, if we follow this path, America will end up weaker from an energy standpoint in the future. We have fewer supplies, higher energy prices, job losses, and further economic pain. So let me explain a little bit, starting with what the administration has actually proposed and what we see as its impact with respect to fossil fuels. First, it wants substantial new taxes on the U.S. oil industry and to end many of their current deductions. Now, the total impact is estimated at somewhere between $3 and $8 billion a year to our industry. But the oil industry is already pretty heavily taxed. Last year, ConocoPhillips, our worldwide effective tax rate was 46%. Now, the oil industry pays taxes roughly double what the average of all other industry. We paid, ConocoPhillips, $13 billion in income taxes, $5 billion in other taxes, and billions more in royalties to state and national governments. The industry is also facing service and supply costs that have more than doubled since the year 2000. So there's not a lot of room for government to put on additional taxes without impacting our ability to develop new energy supplies. I will mention only a few of the new proposals. One would create a new excise tax on production in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf supplies 25% of U.S. production. It is the only U.S. offshore area now open that has yielded world-class discoveries. It is very expensive to operate there in waters thousands of feet deep, 100 or more miles offshore. So the question really is, do we really want to put future development there at risk? There's also a proposal to end the deduction allowed on marginal, or what we call stripper wells. Now, these wells produce in low volumes and are highly sensitive to the cost structure. They supply roughly about 15% of U.S. oil production. We could lose thousands of these wells due to this proposal, and this should be a serious concern here in the state of Arkansas. The administration also proposes to end for the oil industry alone, only the oil industry, the manufacturing tax credit. This credit encourages investment, new investment, and job creation in the U.S. by all industries. Again, do we really want to single out the oil industry and thus discourage investment in domestic production capacity? Moving on, the administration has proposed new procedures to raise royalties received from mineral production on federal acreage. This is despite a 50% increase since 2007 already enacted on offshore production. Raising the royalty rate will increase costs, which inevitably discourage production. Incidentally, lease bonus and royalty payments yielded $23 billion for the federal government last year. There is also a proposal to make oil and gas production ineligible for the percentage depletion allowance. Now, depletion allowance, this is granted to producers of mineral resources. It recognizes that unlike an investment in a factory, for example, mineral production is finite. You have to continually invest, reinvest in finding new oil and gas, or if you don't, you eventually go out of business. Mining companies, even producers of sand, gravel, and dirt, all receive this allowance. Now, for the first time, oil and gas producers will not. This too will discourage domestic production. Even small producers, down to the mom and pop operators with only a few employees, have been targeted. They would be required to extend write-off their geological and geophysical expenses over 7 years instead of 2 years. Now, these G&G expenses are at the heart of exploration for new resources, something logic suggests that the U.S. should encourage. Another measure would charge a fee on non-producing federal leases. It's called, you're familiar with it, use it or lose it. It's as if you bought some land somewhere and where you were then charged a fee for not building and occupying a house fast enough. This despite the fact that you need time to develop building plans, obtain permits, financing, select contractors, and then perform construction. At ConocoPhillips, nearly 70% of our leased federal acreage is producing energy today. Another 1/4 is being actively explored or developed, and this can take years, and leaves only 5% on which work is suspended. But in many instances, for environmental reasons such as drilling restrictions, is why some of that 5% is not actively worked 365 days a year. Any unproductive acreage already automatically reverts to the government when the lease expires. And we pay hundreds of millions of dollars a year in bonus payments and rentals on our leases. The government keeps these payments, even if the leases never produce anything. Clearly, the administration tends to encourage alternative and renewable energy. Meanwhile, it has proposed nothing to encourage oil and natural gas production. It actually seems hostile to these fuels. This is despite the fact that they still offer tremendous potential, particularly from the unconventional sources. Instead of ignoring the foundation of U.S. energy supply, or worse, penalizing it, wouldn't it be far better off using it to drive economic and employment growth? So in conclusion, the administration's energy proposals have been made by people who, without doubt, believe in their hearts that they are doing the right thing and doing good. After all, they're working to create green energy by forcing really an unpopular industry, we haven't communicated well, to pay for it. But their actions will inevitably increase the cost of oil and gas production in the United States. And this will reduce domestic production and make us more instead of less dependent on imported energy. Further, unlike government, our industry, we can't turn on the printing presses to produce money. Any additional taxes on us, we are not in a $140 price environment today. And we have a cost structure that, as I said earlier, has doubled over the last number of years. So additional taxes will ultimately be paid largely by the public and our shareholders. In short, the administration is looking at the energy situation, in my view, through blinders, you can see only the trendy, hot new technologies. They're good, wind, solar, biofuels, and so on. But in automotive terms, they're fixated on, the flashy red sports car, while ignoring the rolling stock that keeps the economy moving, carrying the heavy load day in and day out. We support alternative energy development, but we fear the administration's current alternatives and nothing else approach will have severe unintended consequences. Even if it succeeds in tripling the contribution of alternative energy, this will still satisfy only a small fraction of the total U.S. energy demand over the next several decades. And meanwhile, excessive taxation, continued restrictions on access, our ability to drill and to develop, could cause the U.S. to run short, ultimately, of fossil fuels. Prices would rise, economy would be further impacted, and it ultimately then has an impact to the consumers. We very well may have squandered an opportunity to secure America's energy future. And that is why we must encourage responsible development of all forms of energy, alternatives, renewables, and even fossil fuels, while also addressing greenhouse gas emissions and environmental preservation. So these are my opening comments. I appreciate the invitation to come to the Clinton School, and thank you for coming and listening to my presentation. So I think I have a few moments to take a few questions. Instead, I'd like to be with you for the next 1 or 2 hours, but I'm going to have to get on a plane to get into to a commitment in Europe tomorrow. So maybe we might have a question or two.
We do. If you raise your hand, we'll get the microphone to you, and we'll get this started. Here you go.
Is your company supporting cap and trade or a carbon tax?
We have come out in support of cap and trade, but let me go through that just for a moment. Either approach. If what you want to do is you want to put a price on carbon avoidance, and you want to do it in a way that's efficient. You want to do it in a way that it is going to be an additional cost for energy. You want to do it in a way that's transparent, takes volatility out of energy prices to the best you can. You want to promote doing it as efficiently. You want to not create winners and losers to penalize some industries or others. So the devil's in the details. You can go to a carbon tax, or you can go to cap and trade. Europe has not been all that successful with what they introduced in cap and trade, but I think they've introduced new approaches to it. Most of the rest of the world likes and is moving towards cap and trade. From our perspective, you can do it either way. Now, one of the arguments of carbon tax is, well, it's a tax, but does not necessarily start working on what are some of the limitations of how you reduce CO2 emissions. So from our point of view, we are energy producers, providers. We see the expectation in the public domain. We are not trying to defend or argue the science. We know that public policy is being formulated, and we expect that there will be legislation, maybe not so much in 2009, but more than likely in 2010. So being an energy provider, we need to have a seat at the table. That's why we join and work with U.S. CAP. And we've been working very hard to make sure with other industries and with NGOs, by having a seat at the table, we have some influence on what's being developed. You can do it either way, but I think the predominance of view is that it will probably be cap and trade versus being a carbon tax.
What do you think of, I think it's oil sands, which are in Canada and maybe in the United States also, as a practical source of oil?
Well, I believe in the oil sands. There's a huge amount of oil sands in Canada, and we're one of the biggest participants in the development of oil sands. Now, just about all of our projects are SAGD. They're not mining, surface mining, or we drill wells down thousands of feet deep, and we heat up the bitumen and the rock, the coal, and then we develop natural gas. So we think the environmental footprint is quite a bit less. Now, we understand the carbon footprint of development of oil sands is much higher than conventional and most unconventional oil. So we're spending a lot of money on research and technology to how can we lower the carbon footprint. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars over the next several years, and that program will continue. But when you look at the carbon footprint of oil sands, you have to look ultimately at the total carbon footprint of what you develop oil or bitumen or oil sands, ultimately how it's used in power generation or how it's used in the tailpipe of the automobile. And then the difference is not necessarily all that great. So the real key is, from a strategic point of view, we should be developing indigenous resources in North America. And that takes away some of the reliance and gives more diversity of where we're getting our resources of oil. It fits nicely into the refineries that we have in the mid-continent of the United States. But it doesn't take away that we as an industry have to be doing this year by year in a far better, cleaner, with less environmental footprint. Which leads me to another point. And the other point is that when you look at CO2 emissions in the United States, and you take, where does it all come from? 3% of the CO2 emissions in the United States comes from our industry, the oil and gas industry. 4% comes from locomotives and airplanes. That's 7%. 23% comes from the emissions of trucks and automobiles. So you get up to 30%. Say 35% comes from the power sector of utilities, another third comes from everything else. We need to be responsible. We need, when I talk about winners and losers, we need to participate in making sure that we are addressing climate change and the expectations of the public. But don't task our industry with 30, 40, 50, and 60% of the responsibility of the issue. Everyone to be transparent, fair price, and we want to promote efficiency and use of energy. Just those facts is pretty startling in a way. And we as an industry have not communicated that well. We're not backing away from our responsibility and obligation, but it does give you the metrics of where a third really come from. Another question. Ready?
Yes, sir. What's going on in Alaska? Do you have operations there? Is there new reserves being found? Or are we depleting what we have there now?
Okay. Phillips merged with Conoco back in 2001 when BP acquired ARCO. They had to divest of, to make that go through, had to divest of ARCO Alaska. ARCO Alaska was foundation legacy asset of ARCO. Phillips was fortunate enough to buy it. So we are the largest barrel oil equivalent producer in Alaska. We own approximately 35% of Prudhoe Bay, 55% of Kupari, Alpine. So we look at it and we're in the exploitation phase of keeping the production up. We also are adding to acreage offshore of Chukchi. We think it's on trend that that's to the west offshore of Alaska. Acreage came available, we bid. Shell and ConocoPhillips were the big winners in the bid of about a year ago. So we're optimistic about that, but we want to make sure that the permitting, we can go out there and drill, and hopefully we're successful, can tie into the infrastructure. And the other thing is the gas pipeline from Alaska. A lot of gas resources in Alaska. It's a 10-year project, cost $30, $40 billion, don't know exactly. Cost escalation, what it ultimately will cost. But this is indigenous resources. It's gas. Ultimately, we think it really ought to be developed. It creates investment, creates jobs. And once you get the infrastructure in place, you'll find there's more gas that can be tied in. So very optimistic. It's a very important portfolio position for our company. And I think when it comes down to Alaska, ultimately, sure, natural gas prices at $4 today, or a little bit less than $4, that's too low. I mean, we're going to need a higher price to continue to develop natural gas in our country, and certainly to encourage the development of the gas pipeline from Alaska.
We got time for one more question right
Okay.
here.
Quick.
This is kind of a two-part question. First, with the banking and just, the whole economic crisis, has your ability to pursue exploration been a little crippled by kind of the amount of capital backing and whatnot? And then the second part, the stimulus bill, we hear so much about how it's promoting exploration into new clean energy and whatnot. And so does any of that money come your way? I can probably tell the answer from what I've heard, but...
Okay, on exploration, we really haven't cut back much on our exploration, but with lower pricing environment that comes from a very weak economy and a very deep recession, it impacts on independent producers who explore, so there's less drilling, dramatically less drilling. It has an impact ultimately on supply. But in exploration, larger companies like ourselves, a little more financial capacity doesn't change exploration. Our issue is access. We've got to have access to continue to drill. If you don't give us access around the world, we have difficulty replacing our resources. Now coming to stimulus, I'm going to go answer just a little differently. Job number one. Job number one, and there's a very, very distant second and third for the administration, for Congress, forever. Get this economy moving in the right direction. And fundamentally, what's important there is to restore the viability of the credit markets, the banking institutions. We've got to fix the financial issues. That brings confidence. Work on the economy. Don't try to do too many things at one time. Yes, health care, immigration, energy, all these things are very, very important, but don't try to do too many things at once. Let's get the economy taken care of. That's absolutely job number one, and everything else pales. And if I were in the administration in some way, somehow, I'd say, if you get the economy fixed and as quickly as possible, the American public will give you time to work on the other issues. And I'll take two more real fast questions.
Good, that's
Okay,
fine.
just go ahead.
Super, thank you. Appreciate it. Has your company projected the approximate time we have left to use fossil fuels in our world? When are we going to run out? Second question is, I heard you mention that Conoco was supportive of alternative fuel development. What is Conoco doing specifically to develop those alternative
Okay,
fuels?
on alternative fuels, what we are really doing is spending more of our time and money on accessing human talent, PhDs, technology, research, and just one quick soundbite on that is we really think that we should be making ethanol and things not from food, but be making out of cellulose and things. That doesn't happen. The first question was, you're under the Hubbard's curve. Yes, there's a finite resource of oil, but our view is, my personal view is, that I've said this a few years ago, I don't think the world will ever be using more than 100 million barrels a day, and the reason for that is because some of the national oil companies don't want to develop that quickly. I think conservation will have an impact in terms of how quickly we ramp up demand, and then there's going to be more alternatives and renewables part of the equation. And so for all these reasons, I think it might even be the number is not 100 million barrels a day, it might be even closer to 90 million barrels a day. So it's a finite resource, but if you let the industry free and give us more access and take the shackles off in terms of our ability to go out and explore and have more access, I think we can prolong for a very long number of decades. We won't run out of oil and certainly out of natural gas. And one last question. Okay.
What is the estimated incremental resource potential to opening up the currently closed offshore, I guess, just the currently closed waters in the U.S.?
I think what your question is really what, help me on.
Just the estimated incremental resource potential. So just in terms of barrels compared to what we have right now.
don't really
reserves?
know. I mean, in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of seismic work has been done, so we're pretty optimistic about ultimately there's a lot of resource there that can be developed. The issue we would say is, why not at least look offshore East Coast and West Coast? Do seismic work. I'm not even talking about drilling. Do seismic work to determine what is the potential. And if we know what the potential is, then we can have an informed public debate and judgment then of whether we want to drill or not. But to say we won't even look at what the resource is doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me.
Gentlemen, let's give a round of applause for Jim Mulva.